I'm going to make a series of predictions about you, dear viewer, and all of those predictions are loosely going to be centered around cars. After all, that's why you're here. That's the first prediction. Now, the other prediction is that you like cars in general, but not necessarily all cars. For example, you might like classic cars, but not pre-war cars. You might like fast sports cars, but not EVs. You're getting the gist, of course you are, because you're smart, and that's also why you're here. But the other assumption I'll make on the grounds of cars is that there is a certain category that you can't help but appreciate, and that is the category known as hot hatchback. Like this. Now, the term hot hatchback has been around since the early 1980s, and in 1985, if I remember correctly, it was the Times newspaper that used it for the first time in print when talking about the Volkswagen Golf GTI. Now, since then, all sorts of manufacturers have had a go at the hot hatch, everyone from Ford to Renault to... you get the gist, all of them. But Hyundai, in the past 10 years or so, well, they've decided they want to have a go. And they have, with this. But this isn't a new car. Chances are you've seen this car before. It actually came out in 2017. But the reason I wanted to bring it to light is because later this year, this Hyundai i30N is going to get somewhat of a facelift. But this car in this form is still quite significant. And in this video, I'm going to explain why. Welcome to Driven on YouTube. My name is John Marcar, and this is the Hyundai i30N. Now, arguably, the best thing about hot hatches is that they have the ability to do it all. And this i30N contains all of the crucial ingredients to qualify as a hot hatch. Under that bonnet is a 2-litre turbocharged engine driving the front wheels, pushing out 280 horsepower and 392 newton meters of torque. Around the car, elsewhere, there are other features. For example, sport suspension. It's slightly lower, 8mm lower than the standard i30, and there's also strut bracing at the front and at the back of the car to make it even stiffer than the standard model. But beyond that, what you have to remember is that the i30 in non-N form is a car designed for the masses. It's practical and comfortable and usable every day. So, best of both worlds. This driver's seat is currently set up for my driving position, all 6'1" of me. And as you can see, quite comfortably, all 6'1" of me fits in the back as well. Now, that is partially thanks to these seats. In the i30N, you're given these brilliant, very comfortable, I should say, sports seats, which are actually considerably narrower than the standard non-M seats, which means plenty of room. And you might think that having plenty of room back here, as well as plenty of room up there, would also compromise boot space. Except it doesn't. See? Big boot. Now, the only thing that might become an inconvenience is that strut brace. That is, as I was talking about before, the bracing that keeps the chassis feeling stiff. It is removable. You can do so by taking it off here and here. But if you were wanting to use the car with the seats folded down, that might get a bit annoying. But otherwise, for most situations, that's plenty. Up front, you can see I've got loads of room. In fact, I can even go forward a little bit more. And you'll see in here, there are all sorts of creature comforts that you can expect to see in a car worth a lot more money than this one. I've got some options in here like heated seats, heated steering wheel. I've got a huge infotainment screen here, Apple CarPlay. Admittedly, the phone does need to be plugged in, but it does have Apple CarPlay and Android CarPlay as well. Sound system is standard, very, very good. You can upgrade it, but wouldn't say you necessarily need to. Everything about the car is as you'd want to see, as you'd expect to see. It's a nice place to be. But enough of me sitting still and stationary. Let's hit the road and talk about what this thing is like to drive. So the model we're in is equipped with a fantastic 6-speed manual gearbox. And I genuinely mean that when I say fantastic. The gearbox feels great. The ratios match the performance of the car perfectly. The physical notches of the gears feels really nice. Everything about the gearbox is superb. There is an automatic paddle shift option as well, but it is worth noting that that does come at a price. It's £2,000 more than the manual gearbox, and it does affect the car's tax bracket as well, something to do with the emissions that are produced, I'm guessing slightly more, because the tax bracket for the first year at least does jump up slightly if you go for the paddle shift box. That paddle shift box, by the way, is an 8-speed dual clutch box, so I'm sure very good, but manual gearbox for me. Now, I mentioned when I was sat in the back about these sporty seats. These seats are actually part of what Hyundai are calling mid-life facelift when it comes to this car. As I mentioned at the start, Hyundai are looking to do a full facelift of the i30N a little bit later on this year, but in the meantime, since its launch in 2017, there have been a couple of little tweaks and improvements to the car, these seats being one of them. They are exceptionally comfortable, very, very good, but they're also heated as well, which is a nice luxury to have. So I'm sat comfortably, I've got a lovely gearbox, driving position is great. Everything about this car from a driving point of view is fantastic. I've got very, very little to moan about. And then, of course, as you would expect, there is an array of different settings that you can choose as a driver, and crucially that you can dial in to make the car drive and perform and sound how you want it to drive, perform and sound. There are a few driving modes as standard. You get normal, you get sport, and you get eco, in case you want to try and save a bit of MPG whilst you're driving along. But then, in addition to the driver modes, which can be selected with a button on the left-hand side of the wheel, you've also got the N mode, which can be selected on the right side of the wheel. Now with that, you get a first setting, which is everything in N performance mode, and if you want to get the most out of the car, and by most of course I mean power, then you will need to select one of the N performance modes. The default puts everything into sports mode, which isn't all good in my opinion. One of those things that it does adjust is the dampers. Adjustable dampers as standard on this car, and in N performance mode they are exceptionally stiff. In fact, let me pop it in for you now. Going down this relatively smooth country road, you can already see the difference that it makes. Fortunately though, Hyundai have given you as the driver the option to customize the settings and then save the settings, which is really handy. What I've done, I'm going to take it out of the sporty jiggly super firm mode by hitting the N performance mode again. Now with this, because of the way I've set it up, I've told the car that I don't want to have traction control on. I don't want to have things like brake assist as well, which is where if you get a little bit too close to the car in front of you, the Hyundai will start braking on your behalf. You can turn all of that off, but you do have to almost enter a bit of a contract with the Hyundai by holding down the button for a few seconds to then tell it, yes, I'm sure I don't want traction control, and yes, I'm sure I don't want to have assisted braking as well. Now, another setting that Hyundai have thrown into their N performance modes is sports steering. Here's a tip, don't bother. Just like loads of other car manufacturers, Hyundai have decided that sports steering needs to mean ridiculously heavy, but it's kind of rubbish. It's a bit clumsy and a bit pointless. Keep the steering in comfort, keep the suspension in comfort, everything else in Sport Plus, and you've got a really, really enjoyable and engaging drive. Another setting that I can moan about and grumble about is the addition of artificial sounds. Now, I know why they've done it, I get it. I know that there will be many people that want to hear artificial sounds on their Hyundai. I don't, for example, but again, you can turn it off. It's also got rev matching, a button on the steering wheel here, so that when you're downshifting, the car will automatically rev match for you. Makes your driving sound very impressive, but thankfully you can turn it off. Everything on the car with settings with regards to how the car feels and steers and sounds and drives, it's all interchangeable. So I'm fairly confident you'll be able to dial in a setting that works for you, which I have done, and that is great because then I've got a N performance mode labeled as custom. Simply hold down the buttons on the wheel, to switch between the modes, and then when I want to go back to, say, eco mode, if I'm a bit low on fuel, I can do that, and you'll actually hear that the car quietens down as well. But whilst I'm on the subject of noise, it is worth mentioning the exhaust pipes at the back. Whilst you can have the plumbed in additional sounds here in the back, out back of the car, you're kind of subjected to what you're given, and that is quite a loud noise. Now what's interesting is when I first took delivery of the car, I had a number of people on Instagram who were saying, oh, I love those things, just wish they were a bit noisier. I think this car is plenty noisy. Dare I say it, too noisy. Yes, in N performance mode it does get a little bit noisier and a little bit more exaggerated. However, I think as standard, just driving around, it gets a bit too raucous doing the low speed stuff, and there's no way of quieting it down. Now there's a big turbo under that bonnet, but you wouldn't really know it, other than, of course, the obvious factor of boost pushing you back in your seat. There's no audible soundtrack to it, and I find that quite upsetting. When will car manufacturers understand that induction noise is way cooler than shouty exhaust noises? Ironically, the only way to hear the induction noise from the turbo on that brilliant engine is when you put the car into eco or normal driving modes. In any of the sports modes, the artificial plumbed in exhaust sounds that kick in just completely flood the sound of the turbo up front. And I think that's a real shame. I'm sure it can be changed with perhaps a modification to the induction system or some trickery parts you can put under the bonnet, but then you've got the concern of affecting your 5-year warranty, which this car comes with as standard, I should point out. Silly noises aside though, this thing is genuinely fantastic to drive. The suspension and geometry setup as standard is great. Usually on cars like this, hot hatches, they come with a fairly safe setting out of the box, and likewise with their different sports settings. But I'd say with this, I feel like I'd be very comfortable taking this on a track day, given the predictability and the compliance of the suspension, once I figured out that the sporty settings were a bit unnecessary. The geo setup is great, the brake feel is great, the steering feels great. There's very little about this car from a driver's point of view to moan about. Now I feel I should address one of the key points about this car and the factor that makes it a hot hatch, and that is the power, and namely the ability to put the power down. This is a powerful little thing. 280 horsepower in a front-wheel drive car is pretty spicy. But I have found, despite the fact that the car has an E-diff with various settings for how aggressive you want that diff to be, that should, in theory, help as well with putting the power down when it comes to accelerating from a standing start or accelerating out of corners. But I have noticed that on plenty of occasions, I'm having to regulate the throttle quite severely in order to stop this thing just wheel spinning away. And of course, once I put it into N performance mode and my custom mode, it means that there is no traction control interference at all, and therefore the front end's just skipping and bouncing and barking along whilst it's trying to get some grip. That isn't necessarily a terrible thing from a fun point of view, but I feel like that might compromise the 0 to 60 times slightly. Hyundai claim that the i30N will do 0 to 60 in 5.9 seconds. That's fairly impressive. To me, it could be quite a bit quicker if, for example, that diff was helping put the power down a bit more efficiently. It might be something that could be improved as well with tyre technology. Some stickier tyres might make a bit of a difference, but it is an observation I have to make as standard. The car is just on the verge of perhaps being a little bit too powerful for its own good. That is my only criticism about the tyres though. In every other situation, they feel fantastic. The brakes feel great on this thing, as does, again, I mentioned the geometry, the way that this car feels turning into corners, powering through corners. The car feels brilliantly planted, so I can't grumble about the tyres on that front. The only complaint that I think perhaps a few people might pick up on is the way that they sound. They are quite noisy, but again, it's a performance tyre, low profile, on a stiff chassis. You can forgive it, and you'd be crazy for not forgiving it. This is not a car built for quiet, luxurious, sedate driving. This is one that's been built to be fun, and that's exactly what it is. Now, the one thing I haven't mentioned yet happens to be my favourite thing, I think, about the Hyundai i30N, and that is the price. So why don't we find somewhere to stop, and I'll give you the good news. You see now, prices of everything over the past year or two have gone slightly crazy, and hot hatches are no exception. For example, if you want to go and buy the great Honda Civic Type R, perhaps the most famous hot hatch of them all, that will cost you now £50,000. This, however, this Hyundai i30N, as you see it in this form, seems to me like quite good value at £35,000. And given that perhaps there are a few things you might want to change, exhaust system, induction noises, that sort of thing, if you'd been basing your spend on a £50,000 Civic Type R, suddenly having £15,000 or so spare for a few modifications seems like quite good value. So there we have it, the Hyundai i30N. It is a car that can do it all. It is a performance hot hatch, whilst also being a really great daily driver and without costing the earth. Now, if you want to see a far more comprehensive review of this car, including driving impressions, then head on over to our website, drivenchat.com, where you'll be able to see a full written review of this very car. I've had it a week, and I have an awful lot to say about it. And there, whilst you're on the website, you'll be able to see all of the other things we do, all the other videos we've made, photo shoots we've done, articles we've written, it's all there. Don't forget as well, if you're watching us on YouTube, hit subscribe, and don't forget to hit the little bell notification to see instantly when our next video is uploaded. For now, goodbye.